Robinson Crusoe by Daniel DeFoe. Read aloud by Samantha Dunn. Part 6. I mentioned before that I had a great mind to see the whole island, and that I had traveled up the brook, and so on to where I built my bower, and where I had an opening quite to the sea, on the other side of the island. I now resolved to travel quite across to the seashore on that side. So taking my gun, a hatchet, and my dog, and a larger quantity of powder and shot than usual, with 2 biscuit cakes and a great bunch of raisins in my pouch from my store, I began my journey. When I had passed the vale where my bower stood, as above, I came within view of the sea to the west, and it being a very clear day, I fairly descried the land. Whether an island or a continent I could not tell, but it lay very high, extending from the west to the west-southwest, at a very great distance. By my guess, it could not be less than 15 or 20 leagues off. I could not tell what part of the world this might be, otherwise than that I know it must be a part of America, and, as I concluded, by all my observations, must be near the Spanish dominions, and perhaps was all inhabited by savages, where if I should have landed, I had been in a worse condition than I was now, and therefore I acquiesced in the dispositions of Providence, which I began now to own, and to believe ordered everything for the best. I quieted my mind, and left afflicting myself with fruitless wishes. Besides, after some pause upon this affair, I considered that if this land was the Spanish coast, I should certainly, one time or other, see some vessel pass or repass one way or other. But if not, then it was the savage coast between the Spanish country and Brazil's, which are indeed the worst of savages, for they are cannibals or man-eaters, and fail not murder and devour all the human bodies that fall into their hands. With these considerations, I walked very leisurely forward. I found that side of the island where I now was much pleasanter than mine. The open or savanna fields sweet, adorned with flowers, and full of very fine woods. I saw abundance of parrots, and fain I would have caught one, if possible, to have kept it to be tame, and taught it to speak to me. I did, after some painstaking, catch a young parrot, for I knocked it down with a stick, and having recovered it, I brought it home, but it was some years before I could make him speak. However, at last I taught him to call me by my name very familiarly. But the accident that followed, though it be trifle, will be very diverting in its place. I was exceedingly diverted with this journey. I found in the low grounds hares, as I thought them to be, and foxes, but they differed greatly from all the other kinds I had met with, nor could I satisfy myself to eat them, though I killed several. But I had no need to be venturous, for I had no want of food, and that which was very good too, especially these 3 sorts, viz., goats, pigeons, and turtle, or tortoise, which added to my grapes. Leadenhall Market could not have furnished a table better than I, in proportion to the company. And though my case was deplorable enough, yet I had great cause for thankfulness, and that I was not driven to any extremities for food, but rather plenty, even to dainties. I never traveled in this journey above 2 miles outright in a day, or thereabouts, but I took so many turns and returns to see what discoveries I could make, that I came weary enough to the place where I resolved to sit down for all night, and then I either reposed myself in a tree, or surrounded myself with a row of stakes, set upright in the ground, either from one tree or another, so as to no wild creature could come at me without waking me. As soon as I came to the seashore, I was surprised to see that I had taken up my lot on the worst side of the island, for here indeed the shore was covered with innumerable turtles, whereas on the other side I had found but 3 in a year and a half. Here also was an infinite number of fowls of many kinds, some which I had seen, and some which I had not seen before, and many of them very good meat, but such as I knew not the names of except those called penguins. I could have shot as many as I pleased, but was very sparing of my powder and shot, and therefore had more mind to kill a she-goat, if I could, which I could better feed on, And though there were many goats here, more than on my side of the island, yet it was with much more difficulty that I could come near them, the country being flat and even, and they saw me much sooner than when I was on the hill. I confess this side of the country was much pleasanter than mine, but yet I had not the least inclination to remove, for as I was fixed in my habitation, it became natural to me, and I seemed all the while I was here to be as it were upon a journey, and from home. However, I traveled along the shore of the sea towards the east, I suppose about 12 miles, and then setting up a great pole upon the shore for a mark, I concluded I would go home again, and that the next journey I took should be on the other side of the island, east from my dwelling, and so around till I came to my post again, of which in its place. I took another way to come back, then that I went, thinking I could easily keep all the island and so much in my view, that I could not miss finding my first dwelling by viewing the country. But I found myself mistaken. For being come about 2 or 3 miles, I found myself descended into a very large valley, but so surrounded with hills, and those hills covered with wood, that I could not see which was my way, by any direction but that of the sun, nor even then, unless I knew very well the position of the sun at the time of the day. It happened to my further misfortune that the weather proved hazy for 3 or 4 days while I was in this valley, and not being able to see the sun, I wandered about very uncomfortably, and at last was obliged to find out the seaside, look for my post, and come back the same way I went. And then by easy journeys I turned homeward, the weather being exceeding hot, and my gun, ammunition, hatchet, and other things very heavy. In this journey my dog surprised a young kid, and seized upon it, and I, running in to take hold of it, caught it and saved it alive from the dog. I had a great mind to bring it home if I could, for I had often been musing whether it might not be possible to get a kid or two, and so raise a breed of tame goats, which might supply me when my powder and shot should be all spent. I made a collar to this little creature, and with a string, which I made of some rope yarn, which I always carried about me, I led him along, though with some difficulty, till I came to my bower. And there I enclosed him and left him, for I was very impatient to be at home, from whence I had been absent above a month. I cannot express what a satisfaction it was to me to come into my old hutch and lie down in my hammock bed. This little wandering journey, without settled place of abode, had been so unpleasant to me that my own house, as I called it to myself, was a perfect settlement to be compared to that, and it rendered everything about me so comfortable that I resolved I would never go a great way from it again, while it should be my lot to stay on the island. I reposed myself here a week to rest and regale myself after my long journey, during which most of the time was taken up in the weighty affair of making a cage for my Pole, who began now to be a mere domestic, and to be mighty well acquainted with me. Then I began to think of the poor kid which I had penned in within my little circle, and resolved to go and fetch it home, or give it some food. Accordingly, I went and found it where I left it, for indeed it could not get out, but almost starved for want of food. I went and cut boughs of trees and branches of such shrubs as I could find, and threw it over, and having fed it, I tied it as I did before, to lead it away. But it was so tame with being hungry that I had no need to have tied it, for it followed me like a dog. As I continually fed it, the creature became so loving, so gentle, and so fond, that it became from that time one of my domestics also, and would never leave me afterwards. The rainy season of the autumnal equinox was now come, and I kept the 30th of September in the same solemn manner as before, being the anniversary of my landing on the island, having now been there 2 years, and no more prospect of being delivered than the first day I came here. I spent the whole day in humble and thankful acknowledgments of my many wonderful mercies which my solitary condition was attended with, and without which it might have been infinitely more miserable. I gave humble and hearty thanks that God had been pleasant to discover to me even that it was possible I might be more happy in this solitary condition than I should have been in a liberty of society, and in all the pleasures of the world, that he could fully make up to me the deficiencies of my solitary state, and the want of human society, by his presence, and the communications of His grace to my soul, supporting, comforting, and encouraging me to depend upon His providence here and hope for His eternal presence hereafter. It was now that I began sensibly to feel how much more happy this life I now led was, with all its miserable circumstances, than the wicked, cursed, abominable life I led all the past part of my days. And now I changed both my sorrows and my joys. My very desires altered, my affections changed their gusts, and my delights were perfectly new from what they were at my very first coming. Before, as I walked about, either on my hunting or for viewing the country, the anguish of my soul at my condition would break out upon me on a sudden, and my very heart would die within me, to think of the woods, the mountains, the deserts I was in, and how I was a prisoner, locked up with the eternal bars and bolts of the ocean, in an uninhabited wilderness without redemption. In the midst of the great composures of my mind, this would break out upon me like a storm and make me wring my hands and weep like a child. Sometimes it would take me in the middle of my work, and I would immediately sit down and sigh and look upon the ground for an hour or two together. And this was still worse to me, for if I could burst out into tears or vent myself by words, it would go off, and the grief, having exhausted itself, would abate. But now I began to exercise myself with new thoughts. I daily read the Word of God and applied all the comforts of it to my present state. One morning, being very sad, I opened the Bible upon these words: "I will never, never leave thee, nor forsake thee." Immediately it occurred that these words were to me. Why else should they be directed in such a manner, just at the moment when I was mourning over my condition, as one forsaken of God and man? "Well, then," said I, "if God does not forsake me, of what ill consequence can it be, or what matters it, though the world should all forsake me? Seeing, on the other hand, if I had all the world, and should lose the favor and blessing of God, there would be no comparisons in the loss." From this moment I began to conclude in my mind that it was possible for me to be more happy in this forsaken solitary condition than it was probable I should ever have been in any other particular state of the world. And with this thought, I was going to give thanks to God for bringing me to this place. I knew not what it was, but something shocked my mind at that thought, and I durst not speak the words. "How canst thou be such a hypocrite," said I, even audibly, "to pretend to be thankful for a condition which, however thou mayest endeavor to be contented with, thou wouldst rather pray heartily to be delivered from?" So I stopped there. But though I could not say I thanked God for being there, yet I sincerely gave thanks to God for opening my eyes, by whatever afflicting providences, to see the former condition of my life, and to mourn for my wickedness and repent. I never opened the Bible or shut it, but my very soul within me blessed God for directing my friend in England, without any order of mine, to pack it up among my goods, and for assisting me afterwards to save it out of the wreck of the ship. Thus, and in this disposition of mind, I began my 3rd year. And though I have not given the reader the trouble of so particular account of my works this year as the first, yet in general it may be observed that I was very seldom idle, but having regularly divided my time according to the several daily employments that were before me, such as, first, my duty to God, and the reading the Scriptures, which I constantly set apart some time for, thrice every day. Secondly, the going abroad with my gun for food, which generally took me up 3 hours in every morning, and when it did not rain. Thirdly, the ordering, curing, preserving, and cooking what I had killed or catched for my supply. These took up great part of the day. Also, it is to be considered that the middle of the day, when the sun was in the zenith, the violence of the heat was too great to stir out, so that about 4 hours in the evening was all the time I could be supposed to work in, with this exception, that sometimes I changed my hours of hunting and working, and went to work in the morning, and abroad with my gun in the afternoon. To this short time allowed for labor, I desire may be added to exceeding laboriousness of my work, the many hours which, for want of tools, want of help, and want of skill, everything I did took up out of my time. For example, I was 2 full and 40 days making me a board for a long shelf, which I wanted in my cave, whereas 2 sawyers with their tools and a saw pit would have cut 6 of them out in the same tree in half a day. My case was this. It was to be a large tree, which was to be cut down, because my board was to be a broad one. This tree I was 3 days a cutting down, and 2 more cutting off the boughs and reducing it to a log or piece of timber. With inexpressible hacking and hewing, I reduced both sides of it into chips till it began to be light enough to move. Then I turned it and made one side of it smooth and flat as a board from end to end. Then, turning that side downward, cut the other side till I brought the plank to be about 3 inches thick and smooth on both sides. I was now in the months of November and December, expecting my crop of barley and rice. The ground I had manured or dug up for them was not great, for as I observed, my seed of each was not above the quantity of half a peck, for I had lost one whole crop by sowing it in the dry season. But my crop promised very well, when on a sudden I found I was in danger of losing it all again by enemies of several sorts, which was scarce possible to keep from it. As first the goats and wild creatures, which I called hares, who, tasting the sweetness of the blade, lay in it night and day as soon as it came up, and eat it so close that it could get no time to shoot up into stalk. This I saw no remedy for but by making an enclosure about it with a hedge, which I did with a great deal of toil, and the more because it required speed. However, as my arable land was but small, suited to my crop, I got it totally well fenced in about 3 weeks' time, and shooting some of the creatures in the daytime, I sent my dog to guard it in the night, tying him up to a stake at the gate, where he would stand and bark all night long. So in a little time the enemies forsook the place, and the corn grew very strong and well, and began to ripen apace. But as the beasts ruined me before, while my corn was in the blade, so the birds were as likely to ruin me now when it was in my ear. For going along by the place to see... But as the beasts ruined me before while my corn was in the blade, so the birds were as likely to ruin me now when it was in the ear. For going along by the place to see how it throve, I saw my little crop surrounded with fowls, of I know not how many sorts, who stood as it were watching till I should be gone. I immediately let fly among them, for I always had my gun with me. I had no sooner shot, but there rose up a little cloud of fowls, which I had not seen at all, from among the corn itself. This touched me sensibly, for I foresaw in that few days they would devour all my hopes, that I should be starved and never able to raise a crop at all. In what to do I could not tell. However, I resolved not to lose my corn, if possible, though I should watch it night and day. In the first place, I went among it to see what damage was already done, and found they had spoiled a good deal of it, but that as it was yet too green for them, the loss was not so great, but that the remainder was like to be a good crop if it could be saved. I stayed by it to load my gun, and then coming away, I could easily see the thieves sitting upon all the trees about me, as if they only waited till I was gone away. And the event proved to be so. For as I walked off, as if I were gone, I was no sooner out of their sight, but they dropped down one by one into the corn again. I was so provoked that I could not have the patience to stay till more came on, knowing that every grain that they ate now was, as it might be said, a peck loaf to me in the consequence. But coming up to the hedge, I fired again and killed 3 of them. This was what I wished for, so I took them up and served them as we serve notorious thieves in England, viz., hang them in chains for a terror to others. It is impossible to imagine almost that this should have such an effect as it had, for the fowls would not only not come at the corn, but in short, they forsook all that part of the island, and I could never see a bird near the place as long as my scarecrows hung there. This I was very glad of, you may be sure, and about the latter end of December, which was our second harvest of the year, I reaped my crop. I was sadly put to it for a scythe or a sickle to cut it down. and all I could do was to make one as well as I could out of one of the broadswords or cutlasses, which I saved among the arms out of the ship. However, as my first crop was but small, I had no great difficulty to cut it down. In short, I reaped in my way, for I cut nothing off but the ears, and carried it away in a great basket which I had made, and so rubbed it with my hands, and at the end of all of my harvesting, I found that out of my half peck of seed, I had near 2 bushels of rice, and about 2 bushels and a half of barley. Well, that is to say, by my guess, for I had no measure at that time. However, this was a great encouragement to me, and I foresaw that, in time, it would please God to supply me with bread. And yet here I was perplexed again, for I neither knew how to grind or make meal of my corn, or indeed how to clean it and part it, nor, if I made into meal, how to make bread of it. And if how to make it, yet I knew not how to bake it. These things being added to my desire of having a good quantity for store, and to secure a constant supply, I resolved not to taste any of this crop, but to preserve it all for seed against the next season, and in the meantime to employ all my study and hours of working to accomplish this great work of providing myself with corn and bread. It might be truly said that now I worked for my bread. 'Tis a little wonderful, and what I believe few people have thought much upon, viz., the strange multitude of little things necessary in the providing, producing, curing, dressing, making, and finishing this one article of bread. I, that was reduced to a mere state of nature, found this to my daily discouragement, and was made more and more sensible of it every hour, even after I had got the first handful of seed corn, which, as I have said, came up unexpectedly, and indeed to a surprise. First, I had no plow to turn up the earth, no spade or shovel to dig it. Well, this I conquered by making a wooden spade, as I observed before, but this did my work in but a wooden manner. And though it cost me a great many days to make it, yet, for want of iron, it not only wore out the sooner, but made my work the harder, and made it to be performed much worse. However, this I bore with, and was content to work it out with patience, and bear with the badness of the performance. When the corn was sowed, I had no harrow, but was forced to go over it myself, and drag a great heavy bough of a tree over it, to scratch it, as it may be called, rather than rake or harrow it. When it was growing and grown, I have observed already how many things I wanted to fence it, secure it, mow it, or reap it, cure and carry it home, thrash, part it from the chaff, and save it. Then I wanted a mill to grind it, sieves to dress it, yeast and salt to make it into bread, and an oven to bake it. And yet all these things I did without, as shall be observed. And yet the corn was an estimable comfort and advantage to me too. All this, as I said, made everything laborious and tedious to me, but that there was no help for. Neither was my time so much lost to me, because as I had divided it, a certain part of it was every day appointed to these works. And as I resolved to use none of the corn for bread till I had a greater quantity by me, I had the next 6 months to apply myself wholly, by labor and invention, to furnish myself with utensils proper for the performing all the operations necessary for the making of the corn, when I had it, fit for my use. But first, I was to prepare more land, for I had now seed enough to sow above an acre of ground. Before I did this, I had a week's worth at least to make me a spade, which, when it was done, was but a sorry one indeed, and very heavy, and required double labor to work with it. However, I went through that, and sowed my seed in 2 large flat pieces of ground, as near my house as I could find them to my mind, and fenced them in with a good hedge, the stakes of which were all cut of that wood which I had set before, and knew it would grow, so that in 1 year's time I knew I should have a quick or living hedge, that would want but little repair. This work was not so little as to take me up less than 3 months, because great part of that time was of the wet season, when I could not go abroad. Within doors, that is, when it rained, and I could not go out, I found employment on the following occasions, always observing that all the while I was at work, I diverted myself with talking to my parrot, and teaching him to speak, and I quickly learned him to know his own name, and at last to speak it out pretty loud. Paul, which was the first word I ever heard it spoken in the island by any mouth but my own. This, therefore, was not my work, but an assistant to my work. For now, as I said, I had a great employment upon my hands, as follows, viz. I had long studied by some means or other to make myself some earthen vessels, which indeed I wanted sorely, but knew not where to come at them. However, considering the heat of the climate, I did not doubt but if I could find out any such clay, I might botch up some pot as might, being dried in the sun, be hard enough and strong enough to bear handling, and to hold anything that was dry, and required to be kept so. And as this was necessary in the preparing corn, meal, etc., which was the thing I was upon, I resolved to make some as large as I could, and fit only to stand like jars, to hold what should be put into them. It would make the reader pity me, or rather laugh at me, to tell how many awkward ways I took to raise this paste. What odd, misshapen, ugly things I made. How many of them fell in, and how many fell out, the clay not being stiff enough to bear its own weight. How many crashed by the over-violent heat of the sun, or how many cracked by the over-violent heat of the sun, being set out too hastily, and how many fell to pieces with only removing, as well before as after they drew dried. And, in a word, how, after having labored hard to find the clay, to dig it and to temper it, to bring it home and work it, I could not make about 2 large earthen ugly things, I cannot call them jars, in about 2 months' labor. However, as the sun baked these 2 very dry and hard, I lifted them very gently up, and set them down again in 2 great wicker baskets, which I had made on purpose for them, that they might not break. And as between the pot and the basket there was a little room to spare, I stuffed it full of the rice and barley straw, and these 2 pots, being to stand always dry, I thought would hold my dry corn, and perhaps the meal, when the corn was bruised. Though I miscarried so much in my design for large pots, yet I made several smaller things with better success, such as little round pots, flat dishes, pitchers, and pipkins, and any things my hand turned to, and the heat of the sun baked them strangely hard. But all this would not answer my end, which was to get an earthen pot to hold what was liquid and bear the fire, which none of these could do. It happened after some time, making a pretty large fire for cooking my meat, when I went to put it out after I had done with it, I found a broken piece of one of my earthenware vessels in the fire, burnt as hard as a stone and red as a tile. I was agreeably surprised to see it, and said to myself that certainly they might be made to burn whole, if they would burn broken. This set me to studying how to order my fire so as to make it burn me some pots. I had no notion of a kiln, such as the potters burn in, or of glazing them with lead, though I had some lead to do it with. But I placed 3 large pipkins and 2 or 3 pots in a pile, one upon another, and placed my firewood all around it, with a great heap of embers under them. I applied the fire with fresh fuel round the outside and upon the top, till I saw the pots in the inside red hot quite through, and observed that they did not crack at all. When I saw them clear red, I let them stand in the heat about 5 or 6 hours, till I found one of them, though it did not crack, did melt or run, for the sand which was mixed with the clay melted by the violence of the heat, and would have run into glass if I had gone on. So I slacked my fire gradually till the pots began to abate of the red color, and watched them all night, that I might not let the fire abate too fast. In the morning I had 3 very good, I will not say handsome, pipkins, and 2 other earthen pots, as hard burnt as could be desired, and one of them perfectly glazed with the running of the sand. After this experiment, I need not say that I wanted no sort of earthenware for my use, but I must needs say, as to the shapes of them, they were very indifferent, as any one may suppose, when I had no way of making them but as the children make dirt pies, or as a woman would make pies that never learned to raise paste. No joy at a thing of so mean a nature was ever equal to mine, when I found I had made an earthen pot that would bear the fire, and I had hardly patience to stay till they were cold before I set one upon the fire again with some water in it to boil me some meat, which it did admirably well. And with a piece of a kid, I made some very good broth, though I wanted oatmeal and several other ingredients requisite to make it so good as I would have had it been. My next concern was to get me a stone mortar to stamp or beat some corn in, for as to the mill, there was no thought at arriving to that perfection of art with one pair of hands. To supply this want, I was at a great loss, for as of all the trades in the world, I was as perfectly unqualified for a stone cutter as for any whatever. Neither had I any tools to go about it with. I spent many a day to find out a great stone big enough to cut hollow and make fit for a mortar, and could find none at all, except what was in the solid rock, and which I had no way to dig or cut out. Nor, indeed, were the rocks in the island of hardness sufficient, but were all of a sandy, crumbly stone, which neither would bear the weight of a heavy pestle, or would break the corn without filling it with sand. So after a great deal of time lost in searching for a stone, I gave it over, and resolved to look out for a great block of hard wood, which I found indeed much easier. And getting one as big as I had strength to stir, I rounded it, and formed it in the outside with my axe and hatchet, and then, with the help of fire and infinite labor, made a hollow place in it, as the Indians in Brazil made their canoes. After this, I made a great hard heavy pestle, or beater, of the wood called the ironwood, and this I prepared and laid by against I had my next crop of corn, when I proposed to myself to grind, or rather pound, my corn into meal to make my bread. My next difficulty was to make a sieve, or search, to dress my meal, and to part it from the bran and the husk, without which I did not see it possible I could have any bread. This was a most difficult thing, so much as but to think on. For to be sure I had nothing like the necessary thing to make it. I mean fine thin canvas or stuff, to search the meal through. And here I was at a full stop for many months, nor did I really know what to do. Linen I had none left, but what was mere rags. I had goat's hair, but neither knew I how to weave it or spin it. And had I known how, here were no tools to work it with. All the remedy that I found for this, that at last I did remember I had, among the seamen's clothes which were saved out of the ship, some neckcloths of calico or muslin, and with some pieces of these I made 3 small sieves, but proper enough for the work, and thus I made shift for some years. How I did afterwards, I shall show in its place. The baking part was the next thing to be considered, and how I should make bread when I came to have corn, for first I had no yeast. As to that part, as there was no supplying the want, so I did not concern myself much about it. But for an oven, I was indeed in great pain. At length I found out an experiment for that also, which was this. I made some earthen vessels very broad, but not deep, that is to say, about 2 feet diameter, and not above 9 inches deep. Those I burned in the fire, as I had done the other, and laid them by, and when I wanted to bake, I made the great fire upon my hearth, which I had paved with some square tiles of my own making and burning also, but I should not call them square. When the firewood was burned pretty much into embers or live coals, I drew them forward upon this hearth, so as to cover it all over, and there I let them lie till the hearth was very hot. Then, sweeping away all the embers, I set down my loaf or loaves, and, whelming down the earthen pot upon them, drew the embers all round the outside of the pot, to keep in and add to the heat. And thus, as well as in the best oven in the world, I baked my barley loaves, and became, in a little time, a mere pastry cook into the bargain, for I made myself several cakes of the rice and puddings. Indeed, I made no pies, neither had I anything to put into them, supposing I had, except the flesh either of fowls or goats. It need not be wondered at If all these things took me up most part of the 3rd year of my abode here. For it is to be observed that in the intervals of these things I had my new harvest and husbandry to manage. For I reaped my corn in its season, and carried it home as well as I could, and laid it up in the ear, in my large baskets, till I had time to rub it out. For I had no floor to thrash it on, or instrument to thrash it with. And now, indeed, my stock of corn increasing, I really wanted to build my barns bigger. I wanted a place to lay it up in, for the increase of the corn now yielded me so much that I had of the barley about 20 bushels, and of the rice as much, or more, insomuch that now I resolved to begin to use it freely, for my bread had been quite gone a good while. Also, I resolved to see what quantity would be sufficient for me a whole year, and to sow but once a year. Upon the whole, I found that the 40 bushels of barley and rice was much more than I could consume in a year, so I resolved to sow just the same quantity every year that I sowed the last, in hopes that such a quantity would fully provide me with bread, etc. All the while these things were going, you may be sure my thoughts run many times upon the prospect of land, which I had seen from the other side of the island. And I was not without secret wishes that I were on shore there, fancying the scene the mainland, and in an inhabited country, I might find some other way or other to convey myself farther, and perhaps at last find some means of escape.